Good morning, everybody. Glad to be here. Raleigh, Sadler, and I go back really, really far. We both grew up basically in the same hometown in Florida. Didn't know each other then, but we met at college. We both went to University of Central Florida, and I met my wife through the BCM there, Baptist Collegiate Ministries, Baptist Student Union. You may know it as that. And Raleigh and I were very involved there together. We taught freshman Bible study together, mission trips, all kinds of stuff way back 25 years ago. And so the funny thing was, after that, we went to seminary together as well. And after all that time, our last semester of seminary, we had one class together, our first time. So we managed to take practice of ministry together with Herschel York, and that was a great, amazing class. But I've known him for a long time and have watched the Lord use him in a mighty way as he started this incredible ministry called Let My People Go. Of course, using Moses' statement that the Lord told him to say to Pharaoh and rescuing people from slavery. And as you probably know, we have modern day slavery all around the world, but all around us here in Memphis. And so Raleigh has worked hard to educate churches and mobilize churches to help fight that, to meet the needs of the most vulnerable all around us. So I'm really grateful that you came. I know he is as well. And I'm praying that the Lord multiplies the impact of today as we talk and as the Lord works through our churches as a result of this session. Let's pray and we'll let Raleigh get started. Father, I thank you for these men. I thank you for the churches and believers and families and children of God that they represent. God, I'm thankful that we have a hope that shines an unfailing light into the most dark situations, that pierces the darkness. God, I am thankful that Jesus is the light of the world, that he sent us. Lord, I pray that you would make a difference in Memphis through us, through our churches. Lord, I pray that people who feel hopeless and trapped and even enslaved would know the gospel and would know freedom through us. God, I pray that you would rescue their bodies and their souls, that they would come to know Jesus. Lord, I pray that you would do a work through this meeting. Lord, I pray that you would anoint Raleigh, fill him and fill us with your Spirit. Speak to us, change us. God, we just ask that you would bless our meeting together today, and thank you for the chance to be here. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks, man. Good morning. So I'm pretty impressed by how many people showed up today, because I've been brought to speak at conferences, and you never know, it's a mixed bag. Sometimes you go in and you're like, man, there's going to be a ton of people. There's like 4 people that show up. And then you know, self-doubt starts to creep in at that point. You're like, did I not brush my teeth? Did I not wear deodorant? Am I just a failure at life? And then you realize maybe it doesn't have to do with you. Maybe when people hear of a topic like human trafficking, the first thing we do is get nervous. It's too much. It's too much. Too dirty. I'll never forget this guy. After my book, Vulnerable: Rethinking Human Trafficking, came out, this person I went to high school with, he came up to me at like a holiday party, and he looked at me and he said, hey man, I was reading your book and I got halfway into the 2nd chapter and I had to stop reading. I said, why? Why'd you stop reading? And he goes, because I was afraid, you know, Raleigh, I have a daughter and I was afraid that she could get trafficked. And I think I looked at him and I'm like, well, then read the whole book. She'll be all right. Like, if you read the book, you'll be fine. But I think at the end of the day, we don't want to face difficult things. It's a human problem. Because when we face the vulnerability of others, it shows us our vulnerability. See, I founded Let My People Go to empower the local church to fight human trafficking by loving those most vulnerable, but not to do it from a standpoint of having it together, a standpoint of projected strength, but to do it as vulnerable people, loving other vulnerable people, as we worship a Messiah who became vulnerable for us. Because it's easy to look into someone's eyes and then realize that we don't have it together and we want to push that person away. And so I'm glad you're here. This is a step of faith. Thank you for giving me an hour and 20 minutes, and I hope it will be just a good opportunity for all of us. I want to let you know what I'm covering today. I'm going to be covering what human trafficking is and what it isn't. We're going to go through a basic biblical background. Third, we're going to talk about the role of vulnerability, both in the exploitation of people and in meeting the needs of people. Then we're going to talk about red flags of human trafficking. We're going to touch on the role of trauma. Then we're going to touch on the role of the church, and then with that, we're going to go into next steps and then go to lunch. So I want to tell you about my friend Anna. I had just moved to New York at that time to start Let My People Go, and I really didn't know how we were going to impact human trafficking. I had an idea, and then I honestly thought, awareness was key, and I do think awareness is important. So I was going to make shirts, and we're going to sell shirts, and I was going to make my money, and I was going to feel good about myself, and it was going to be great. I was going to be able to virtue signal and say I'm doing something to end anti-trafficking, and I was going to be really happy with it. And I remember talking to my friend Anna on the phone, and she's telling me this story of how she had been exploited. And I want you to pay attention to the details of this story because I'm going to ask you questions about it later. But she'd grown up as a young woman who was adopted into a Caucasian family. She was of South Asian heritage, I guess would be the best way to describe it. And she didn't look like anyone that she went to school with in South Carolina. And she struggled with self-worth. She struggled with not fitting in. She didn't feel like she was pretty. And then she met a man 20 years her senior. And he just laid it on. You're beautiful. I love you. I care about you. And then they picked up an art project together. That art project was nude photography. But she was the only one. That's what he would say. Time would pass. He would die. And she watched the movie Taken, which isn't a great movie when it comes to human trafficking. It's an entertaining movie. I like Liam Neeson. I have no problem with Liam Neeson. He's great. The movie's just a little sensational. And she said, but I realized by watching that movie, that happened to me. So I went to his house and found all these photos of other people. And then she realized that he had been selling them or giving them away. And then she just realized that she'd been trafficked. And so as we're talking about it, I just asked her one question that would ultimately change the trajectory of my life and the trajectory of Let My People Go's. I said, what did the local church do for you when you were being exploited? Like, help me understand that. What did the local church do? And you know what she said? She just started laughing. She said, Raleigh, for several years, I was being exploited and no one noticed. But to be honest, I didn't notice because oftentimes survivors don't self-identify. They need someone to come alongside of them and say, that's not right. What happened to you is not okay. And help them recognize power and control and how that was used to exploit them. But yeah, she said, they didn't notice and I didn't notice. But most of the time when I went to church, and I was in church every Sunday, people would say, hey, how you doing? And I'd say, good. And then they'd walk to the next person. You see, they never asked the second question. I think we can feign community and we can do it really well. But you can't pretend your way into community. Community is rugged, it's nasty, it's vulnerable. It requires two people having not only to face each other, but to face themselves and grow together. That's messy work, but that's what you're called to. Every one of you is called to that. And as someone who has been a pastor, and that's why I think that's why God called me into this, is because I'm able to kind of not only speak the language, but I know what pastors and church leaders deal with. You don't need another thing added to your plate. But I think when we focus on vulnerability and we actually focus on the people who could be like Anna and actually get to know them and encourage our congregations to do the same, we're going to fight trafficking without even knowing it. And so before I dive into what human trafficking is, I want to talk about what it isn't. And so we're going to deal with a couple of popular myths, or more than a couple. We're going to deal with several popular myths. First, the first myth I want to talk about is human trafficking only happens over there. Doesn't happen here in our backyard. Only happens in other countries, in other nations. That's false. Human trafficking impacts as many as 50 million people worldwide. Cases have been reported in every country, but also every state and almost every county in the United States. Another myth is that human trafficking is only kidnapping for sex. People are only trafficked when they're kidnapped for sex. I mean, kidnapping can and does happen. Sure, it does. But by and large, that's not the tool that traffickers use the majority of the time. The majority of the time, they groom people. Like my friend Anna. I love you. I care about you. They find that vulnerability. They're like sharks in water. They know what to do when they sense the blood and go to the injured person. They know how to exploit it, whether you are looking for money, love, a job, friends, a place to live. They know how to exploit that vulnerability for their gain. I'll never forget, after my book came out, I had a chapter on how kidnapping is not the primary way that traffickers use. It's not their primary tool. And this person, I don't know if you remember, I don't know if you remember several years back, there was a viral, and we'll talk about, this leads into the next myth, the viral human trafficking event. Like, don't go to Target. They're trafficking people at Target. I was at Target and I was pushing the cart, and this woman, and they always bring up their ethnicity. She was from like the West Indies, and she was with these other people, and she grabbed my child and said, "Say goodbye to mommy. Say goodbye to mommy." She was going to traffic my child for sex. That is an actual story that went viral. Now, even the police, when they were interviewed for the story, and I mean, it was on everything. It was on Oprah. It was on all the things. And it sells because it focuses on our fear, the things that we're afraid of. It's sensational. But the police, when they were interviewed, they're like, yeah, it just doesn't feel like human trafficking, though. Now, that person could have been trying to hurt that child. Sometimes when you're in Walmart and that person's following you, or they're following your wife or their kid, they could intend harm. They could try to kill them, but they're probably not going to traffic them. Doesn't mean what they're doing isn't bad. Doesn't mean it's not shady. Just doesn't mean it doesn't mean that it fits what the profile of what a trafficker would do. Yeah.
Are you saying that they won't pick up people from Walmart, Target, or some place like that?
Often not. Often not for trafficking. That doesn't mean that they won't start a relationship to groom them there. But when you think that kidnapping is the primary role, it's not only kidnapping. It can and does happen, and I try to say that carefully. It can and does happen, but the overwhelming percentage of people who are trafficked were trafficked through relationship. Because, it's when you just worry about the big white vans. Now, you could still worry about them, but just know that oftentimes it's the person who's closer. The person, The person who's known and trusted, the person that you're not thinking about, that's the person. And I'll never forget the person who she popularized that view, that viral view. She reached out to me after my book, and I knew something was wrong because she was like, I just want to talk to you because you're so smart, you're so intellectual, why you give me compliments? I do not know you. Why are you being nice? Don't be nice. And then come to find out she wanted to, she was pretty upset. But at the end of the day, I say it can and does happen because I've met people who were, but it's not the overwhelming narrative. And so if we're focusing on that at the expense of grooming and other things, you're going to miss it. You're going to miss it happening in your community. Another myth is that victims will always seek help if they escape. That's a good one, because that plays into our Messiah complexes. That's the damsel in distress. That's the damsel in distress. Here's the deal. Sometimes it's not the damsel in distress, it's the damsel that causes distress. I remember talking to, he was leading the vice squad of the NYPD focused on human trafficking. And he's talking about his first bust when they break wide open, this trafficking ring in New York City. And he said, here's this sweet girl that he's coming to save. And, she looked at him and she just went wild. She's swinging on him. She's threatening him. She's trying to fight him. Because at the end of the day, he's arresting someone that has not only been her lover and her pimp, but a father figure. This is someone who, in many ways, has been closer to her than her family. And often traffickers will isolate the people they victimize from their family so that they depend solely on them. But the captain was like, I just started calling her Peanut because she looked like a peanut. But Peanut was just coming at me and she was trying to attack me. And I'm like, calm down, it's okay. And he's like, I learned in that moment that she didn't know what she didn't know. That was her family. Even though that wasn't good and it wasn't healthy, she didn't want it being taken away, because there are good times. When this would go into the next myth, that all traffickers are monsters. Oh man, if you ever do an interview for a sports radio program when you're not really an athletic guy, but if you ever do one, don't ever do a Q&A, an open Q&A on a sports radio program in New Jersey. Don't ever do it, because I did it. And this guy said, and I've heard this so many times, even heard this from the guy who co-wrote the book When Helping Hurts, Steve Corbett. We were talking once and he was like, I need to start a ministry called Castrations for Christ. I was like, it's a little intense and I'll have to edit that out, but thank you. Thank you. But he was super cool because he kind of caught into this idea of, we want to eliminate it and these people are monsters and we need to stop it. So I get this guy who's on the Q&A and he's like, they need to all be castrated. They're all monsters, and he's just going he sounds really bold and it's great, heroic. But I said, sir, I want to say this with as much care as I can, but if we're looking for monsters, we're not going to see the people who are doing it, because they come off just like you and me. Oftentimes they're gregarious. Oftentimes they're narcissistic or narcissists. And they know how to play and manipulate everyone. Most traffickers are master manipulators. And for that matter, most sex buyers look just like us. There have been difficult times in my ministry where I walk into meetings and people who are survivors will have a hard time because I fit the profile of a sex buyer. Oftentimes, overwhelmingly, sex buyers in America are middle-aged white men, regardless of who's being sold. Now, anyone can be trafficked, anyone can traffic, and anyone can buy sex. But when we're looking for the monsters, we're not going to see the people in our midst. We're just not. The next myth is only women and children are victims of human trafficking. This is a popular view. Most of your movies that you've seen focus on children. But overwhelmingly, the type of trafficking that is the largest worldwide is labor trafficking. Now, there was a statistic by the UN many years ago that basically said 68% of all human trafficking was for labor, 22% was for sex, and then domestic servitude after that. Sex it literally does sell even in the anti-trafficking movement. It's always going to be more sensational. It's always going to be more popular. But we can kind of turn a blind eye to labor trafficking, especially when it impacts us. I was speaking in a church in North Florida, and I mentioned that if we're not paying fair wages to our workers, not only do we need to deal with that and square with that scripturally, because that is in the Bible. It's in there. It's Old Testament, but it's a good principle. But I said, we need to understand that the people, we may not be trafficking to people, but the people may be exploited coming to us. I've seen this in restaurants. People who are underage not being paid fair wages. We need to ask questions and get away from the idea of, well, they're probably just sending all that money back home. Well, first of all, how much money are they actually making? Like, we don't know. Like, we have to realize that most victims of human trafficking are hidden behind our assumptions. And just because we assume a narrative doesn't mean we listen to someone's story. And so I think when it comes to that, we need to understand that, yes, men, women, and children are trafficked. But we typically focus solely on the children at the expense of the others. Now, we should focus on them, but we should also focus on the others, yes. Yeah, 100%. And thank you for asking that question. And I want to address this we have to understand, and I have seen this through multiple administrations, both conservative and progressive. When it's politicized, it's always politicized for the gain of the candidate, regardless of which party they focus on. And so some people will say, well, they'll talk about the border, and they'll say a lot of people are being trafficked over the border. Again, this is where I'll say maybe. But what we're finding in the data is that most people who are trafficked from other countries come through legal ports of entry, which I think makes it actually more insidious, because you've been to airports, you've been into bathrooms, you've seen the if you're trafficked call, you've seen the things that light up. If you're a victim of trafficking, that's there. But that's how good traffickers are, is they will do it right under our nose. So I'm sure people are trafficked into porous areas of like our country's boundaries, I'm sure. Well, the thing that makes me nervous is, you get these children who completely disappear. But then more than that, you get like what's happening in New York with all these people from Texas being bused there and being bused to other cities. I get what's happening, but at the end of the day, those people, I don't think, deserve that. And a lot of times you'll see, like New York, they did this. They broadcast where they were coming in and where all the services were. And my friend who is leading an incredible organization in New York City for caring for those experiencing homelessness, he said, I just need to know, could a trafficker see this and use it? And I'm like, man, it's basically a menu. And so most of the people who are trafficked in New York, they're the people looking for another chance, and they go into Port Authority on the bus. They're leaving domestic violence or a bad home life, and they come, and then they get there and they realize, I don't have anywhere to stay, and then this person sees the need. And that happens at a lot of bus stations and train stations and things like that, because people, they're waiting. But right now,
Let me be clear.
yeah,
Saying they leave their foreign country, cross the border, and then suddenly realize they don't have any place to stay.
well, some of these people, I would say, they get there and they didn't take everything into account. They can't afford it. Their money runs out. But yeah, like a lot in New York, a lot of them will just be sleeping in the Port Authority, which is a pretty intense place if you have to take an early morning bus ride or something, like, because you will be like mobbed by people who just woke up. Give me money, give me money, give me money. But yeah, it's really wild what happens when you realize that you are vulnerable and you run out. Like you,
And so you're categorizing people who cross the border legally, come into Texas, where I'm from,
mhm.
and then they're transported by the government to another state. You consider that human trafficking?
No, I don't consider that human trafficking. I think they can be trafficked, yes, as a result. But yeah. I don't think our government is trafficking people, but I do think trafficking can be state-sponsored, and I do think we're having that in China. But
So would you consider flying people from a foreign country into the country with our government allowing that to happen? Would that be considered trafficking?
you're asking really great questions, and I will definitely get to that when I start talking about human trafficking. And we'll talk about what it is, and right now we're going to focus on what it isn't. And so, but there are a few pieces that have to be present for human trafficking to be human trafficking. And so we'll talk about that in a few moments. Another aspect, another myth is that traffickers they're strangers. They're kind of like stranger danger. And you've seen enough crime shows probably to know that most people who exploit others are people that we know, people that we trust. And so oftentimes traffickers and those that they traffic come up in the same neighborhoods and communities. Now, sometimes they're people that are met online and they're groomed in that way, but they can be friends, family members, romantic partners, teachers, anyone who kind of knows that person's vulnerability and knows how to exploit it. And the last myth I want to talk about before we go into an overview of what human trafficking is that human trafficking always requires highways. I have heard this one 1,000 times of talking with pastors. Well, we don't really have a problem with human trafficking because we're over here. We're not on the highway. Human trafficking does not imply movement. I tell this conversation. This conversation is portrayed in my book, where I sat down with the ambassador at large to combat and monitor human trafficking for the Obama administration. And the reason was he was so instrumental in human trafficking legislation worldwide. And so we were talking about that, and he goes, the problem with the term human trafficking is that it implies movement. And it doesn't. Oftentimes, people never leave the neighborhood they grew up in many cases. And so when we just think it implies movement, again, we're looking for this when it could be happening in our community under a different label. Oh, that girl, she just likes to be with guys, and she's choosing to be, we would say, prostitute, when ultimately, in many cases, she's prostituted. This isn't something she chose. But it doesn't require highways. That doesn't mean it can't happen on highways. But we'd be amiss if we just thought it happened on the road. And so now to answer some of your questions, let's talk about what it is. I think, to be succinct, human trafficking is the exploitation of vulnerability for commercial gain, whether it's for sex, labor, or domestic servitude. Someone with power and status, it doesn't have to be a lot, just more than the person they're exploiting, exploits someone with less. Yeah, human trafficking is the exploitation of vulnerability for commercial gain, whether it's for sex, labor, domestic servitude. Mm-hmm.
And also, they do this to kidnap children and such for body parts. They harvest human organs and sell them in the black market.
Yeah, and you'll see that a lot in South and Central Asia, or not South, well, yeah, there, but Central America, South America, China. Yeah, they said at one point 70%, and you'd have to check this stat, it may have changed. 70% of all the kidneys that were on the market were black market kidneys or something. I read that a long time ago.
So it's only if it's for personal, for financial gain. Is that what you're saying?
It's for commercial gain, oftentimes, but sometimes people will do it for, yeah, they'll do it for some. It can look differently in every perspective, but yeah, they'll do it for some form of commercial gain. Mm-hmm. And so, over the years, I've had the opportunity to talk to the ambassador at large to combat and monitor human trafficking for the Bush administration, Mark Ligon, Lou DeBaca at the Obama administration, and John Cotton Richmond at the Trump administration. And what you'd be glad to know is each of them are Christians, and their faith is ultimately driving them to do this. And I love that. But the reason I love Lou DeBaca, and I probably really enjoyed my time with him the most, was he was part of developing the Palermo Protocols, which laid out what human trafficking was. And this is how the UN defines human trafficking under the Palermo Protocols. They say that human trafficking is defined as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability, or of giving or receiving payments or benefits to achieve the consent of another person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. So I'll read that again and then I'll explain it. The recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat of use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or a position of vulnerability, or of giving or receiving payments or benefits to achieve the consent of another person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. And that exploitation would be sex, labor, domestic servitude, trafficking of organs.
That's one form of slavery.
Huh?
That's one form of slavery.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Kill one another human being
Yeah.
too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think to understand this definition, which it has been termed modern-day slavery, we need to see that the three parts, and this is important, the three parts are broken down. I don't expect any of us to memorize this, but the three parts are broken down into act, means, and purpose. So the act we see in the definition is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. That's the act of human trafficking. Recruitment, so if someone's recruiting someone into the life, into prostitution, if they're grooming them, if the person is an Uber driver and they're transporting them knowingly. We've heard some good stories of Uber drivers who recognize the signs because they know the act, means, and purpose, and they call. But if they do it knowingly, transferring, getting one person from one place to another, harboring, they can stay here. Receipt of persons, having someone deliver someone to your door. That is an act of human trafficking. The means, best way to know it is force, fraud, and coercion. They could be a Romeo pimp where I love you, I really care for you, you matter. Or they could be, which is ultimately fraud. Or you can work for this job, you can work for us, we're going to get you out of that situation and you're going to be happy, you're going to have everything you want. The American dream, you can come over here from whatever country you're in and get a great job in the hospitality industry. Fraud. But you got to pay off this debt. Then they trap them with debt bondage. And until they pay off the debt, they can't leave. You see that a lot in labor trafficking and a good amount in sex trafficking. So you've got fraud. Force would be something that we would call them guerrilla pimps, guerrilla traffickers, where they beat the person up within an inch of their life so that they would do what the person wants them to do. Now, the problem with force is it doesn't really work too well because people don't want to buy a damaged product. If people are seeing people as products, they don't want that at all. So when you force someone to do something, you may not get as far. That's why the kidnapping thing isn't the most prevalent tool in the trafficker's tool belt. Yes.
One that seems like someone made sense of this is wrong would kick in more if they're being beat up, right? Because I am being trafficked, right?
That's right.
I'm more likely to run rather than stay under the manipulation, I guess.
That's right. Absolutely. And now, that doesn't mean that once someone has done the fraudulent side as a Romeo pimp or Romeo trafficker and won the person over and got them dependent, that they won't use the threat of force. A friend of mine, she was groomed by her trafficker, but to keep her in line, he would put a gun to her head and pull the trigger as the clip fell out. And I remember her saying, she's like, I didn't know if I was alive or dead. But he continued to traumatize her so that she would be compliant, that she would do whatever he wanted, and that she would be afraid of him. But he didn't start with that. And the last is coercion. If you don't do this, then I'm going to do this. Can't tell you how many people I've come across where their trafficker said, I've taped this video of you and this buyer, and if you don't do what I'm going to say, like I'm going to send this to your parents, or I'm going to harm your parents, or I'm going to send this to your church, or I'm going to put this online. And sometimes the person gets away, they still put it online. And I've had to talk with my friends at the FBI to see how we can get those videos down. And it's tricky because it all depends on state regulations. And every state and county and community is different. And so sometimes people can appeal to like Facebook or Twitter, or Pornhub or these places, but yeah, they can't get it down. And that's the thing, like even with Pornhub, not everyone there has chosen to be there. Many people there, and they found this recently, the videos of their exploitation lived on that site. And so I'm going to share the story of my friend Chandra, and I want you to be listening for the act and the means. And the purpose, of course, is sexual exploitation, forced labor, organ trafficking. And so I'm going to tell my friend Chandra's story, and I want you to listen for the act, means, and purpose. Chandra lived in Indonesia, and there was a time of political upheaval. The government was shifting, and she didn't know what to do. She came from a very poor family. She wanted a better opportunity, and she had a daughter. So she decided to look online, and she found, she was in her 20s, and she found a website online that these people were offering jobs in the hospitality industry. So she took it. And they were so great, and they were so just amazing with her. They flew her into JFK International Airport. She went through immigration, she went through customs, and then she was supposed to be driven to Chicago, where she'd work in a hotel. But her taxi didn't take her to Chicago, but it took her to Brooklyn. And in Brooklyn, she was taken and sold to a trafficker who owned an illicit massage parlor. And she was there with women from all over the world. And she was trafficked. And she, at times, was deprived of food. She was allowed to drink, or she was allowed a cucumber soup, which had a little tiny bit of cucumber, and it was just water. And she was, oh, no problem. I was like, what does that sound? She was allowed that, but she wasn't given much nutrients. And she had felt kidnapped, but in reality, she was groomed. But the groomer was so good at it. But yes, she was kept under lock and key. Passport was taken. And she escaped. But then this other person found her as she was on the streets, basically homeless. Hey, I care for you. You matter. And then she ended up trafficked again. And she got out of that. But she was homeless for a very long time. Which is why we focus on vulnerable populations, because at the end of the day, the person who's on the street could have been trafficked, they may be trafficked, or they may be targeted for trafficking. We don't know. But if you focus on vulnerability, you're going to do intervention, prevention, and aftercare all in one fell swoop. But that said, what's the act in Chandra's story? Yeah, the grooming part. Yeah, absolutely. What else? Anything else? Because there's more than... Well, you were talking about the transportation. Your transportation. Yeah, that's... Yeah, because there was the receipt of the person, and then the transportation, transfer. Mm-hmm. Anything else?
So it really began with offering her hope for a job. She was desperately needed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they were preying on her vulnerability, weren't they? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a full-on lure, and it's often if they find someone with an issue, like their vulnerability is that they're on drugs. Like it's really easy, and I've talked to people, like even in churches where we have really good people in our churches, and they see someone, like, okay, the problem at our church is the kids that smoke in the parking lot. You know, we often see the people who could be victimized as the villains. And when we villainize the people that are victimized, we miss an opportunity. These kids smoking in a parking lot, there may be way more to their story. I don't know. Maybe they just like smoking Marlboro Reds. I'm not sure. But I do know that a trafficker is going to seize that and say, you want to smoke something real, smoke this. Or, you know, it's like they're always going to push the envelope a little bit more. If the person has a problem, they're going to ply them with drugs. If they don't have a problem, they'll often get them addicted. But it all depends on what kind of trafficking they're doing and how they want the person to do it. Because I've had friends who were trafficked and they're like, I could just turn my brain off. Because with the trauma they'd experienced, they could just go numb, do what they had to do. And oftentimes they wouldn't get to even see the money. One of my friends never saw the money exchanged. So when people are like, oh, you know, these people, they get paid so much. Well, their manager gets paid, who's often their trafficker. And so what do you think the means were Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that fraud piece, right? Like, you're going to get something out of this. She thought she was going to get something better than what Indonesia had to offer. And then she got to Brooklyn. Yeah. Yeah, they preyed on desperation. And the purpose was for sex trafficking. But what I love about my friend Chandra is she's a believer. Even though she's had really bad experiences in the church and she hasn't been received well, especially early on with churches, she now is very passionate about seeing the church mobilized. She cares for the church. And
Clarify that, that she had bad experiences in church, and just think, what do you mean exactly?
yeah,
What church did or didn't? How should it go?
what I would say sometimes when we are well-meaning, because I'm very pro-church, but I've also had to look at my own house. It's very easy if someone's experienced trauma to see them as like, we may not understand that they're experiencing trauma. We may just kind of see them as, oh, that person's just a lot. They're high maintenance. They got it. And we may not know our own vulnerabilities well enough to know how we're going to respond to the people who are a lot. And if that's us, then our people, they may not be prepared to the point where they just push people away as kind of like, a person's kind of a troublemaker. And I think she was knee-deep in trauma. And she was part of a church that wasn't really trained to recognize and respond to people who were vulnerable. And which is why we do what we do, because I think at the end of the day, I think most of us in the Christian community are well-meaning. At least we should be. We've got the spiritual DNA for it. We just may not be prepared, and we may not be aware of our own trauma and how that interacts with the trauma of others.
Share that with you, I know, put me on the spot, but like that's helped me think about things, because you talk about people in our community who are living so on the edge, it causes them to do things that they wouldn't have done before because it's like rewire their thinking.
Yeah. Even when it comes down to, and the example I use, I'll make it real fast so you're going there. So, say if a young man wants to go to the movies, right? So he wants to go to the movies and he's thinking, okay, I don't have the money right now. You know what? I'll take a gun and go rob Johnny at gunpoint, so I can get his cell phone and I can probably sell it for $20, so that I can go to the movies and buy some popcorn and juice. See, he reasoned in his mind that this was a good way to earn $20, not understanding what that gun charge is going to do, not understanding the trauma that just placed on this person. I talked to a man who's doing construction work and how they robbed him at gunpoint, and kind of his thought process now, at work, and kind of how he is now. So they don't see all that, but they reason in their mind that this is reasonable, all right, and not seeing all that, so it causes more and more trauma. And then just because that's just part of just the rewiring of the brain. So life is hard, and Johnny, life is hard for you today. Drop it off. So it is a numbing of that.
But that would explain why some people might stay in crappy situations. They're reasoning.
Well, and it's interesting to your point. I remember the first sentencing of a trafficker that I went to, and I went to support one of my friends who was supporting the young lady who was there for the sentencing. And that's actually very brave of her, because most trafficking survivors don't go to the sentencing. But this guy, I'm watching him, and I've actually seen a couple, and one, he was super gregarious and manipulative. He was trying to like get out of it even at that point. He was absolutely a narcissist. But the one that really caught me was this man who, I mean, he was just numb, like you described it. And he trafficked this girl who was his quote-unquote girlfriend. But they were both experiencing homelessness. And he went to Rikers, and I heard a report of like this guy messed with him at Rikers, and he cut the guy's face in half. Like it was just, he was brutal, and it was hard for me to see his humanity. But then when I got home, I remember sitting in my office at the Metropolitan New York Baptist Association on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I just sat there. And have you ever seen the movies when people sit down and then a clock spins? You ever see that? That's what it was. I didn't move for like 5 hours. I did not know what was wrong with me. We have to be careful. This is an aside, but as we care for vulnerable people, there is vicarious trauma. There is secondary trauma. And I was in the throes of it. I lost time. My brain didn't know that I hadn't experienced that. And so my brain was acting like I had experienced that. So I have to, and any pastor who's going to care for their most vulnerable neighbors, whether you're addressing human trafficking, poverty, you've got to make sure that other people are around you, that you've got people you can talk to, and you've got to grow in self-awareness to the point where you know that if something's off, like if I'm a little bit edgy, if I'm a little nasty this week, you got to realize that it might not be because you're a terrible person. Maybe. There's grace for that. But it might be that you're in the thralls of trauma. And so I remember as I was processing my vicarious trauma in a moment, which I didn't know. I didn't know that I was experiencing vicarious trauma. But I remember thinking, the most unpopular thing about this is I could see that guy's vulnerabilities too. I could see that he wasn't given a good childhood. I could see that he, as an adult, was struggling. He's still 100% culpable for exploiting this person, but he acted out of his vulnerabilities. He acted out of a sense of self-protection and trying to fix his problem by exploiting someone else. And so I started realizing just how deep this vulnerability thing goes, that it's not only the vulnerability of the victims, but it's the vulnerability of the victimizers. And how can the church come alongside of both victim and victimizer, care for them, point them to the gospel, yes, but don't stop at their soul. Care for them holistically. How can we involve them in community? And if someone does deserve to have the police called on them, call the police. But at the end of the day, we need to address the needs of the whole person. And I think this...
touched on is the reality that pastors and shepherds, one of the things that we have to accept is the fact that we love as Christ loved, we're going to face that.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
I was sharing the hurt.
Yeah.
I only know one way to shepherd the sheep is God who touches my care, and this with all my heart.
Come on.
So we're going to find that whatever trauma they're dealing with, whether it's traffic and abuse, whether it's dealing with health issues, whatever it may be, we're going to share that sorrow, that suffering,
That's 100% right. And I think one of the biggest, I'm glad I had this realization, but I didn't want it. I didn't want it. I never wanted to ever admit that I needed help, especially when I was a pastor. I remember someone saying, well, you could think about maybe counseling because you're processing a lot. And I'm like, no, I'm a pastor. I counsel people. I don't need counseling. That is a lie from the pit. Like we all need it, especially those of you who are dedicated. Like when you say you're leading with a pastor's heart, I think that's beautiful. And I'm a heart first kind of person too. And man, this heart's taken some hits. And at this stage, and this is free, and I accidentally fell into this, but having a team around you, whether it's men from here, because I hear you guys meet weekly. Respect. I've talked to associations across the country, and it's like once a month, once every 3 months, and you guys are like, no, we need this. Yeah, we need each other. So having a team around you as you're caring for vulnerable people, whether it's counselor, other pastors, but you need people that you can be real with because the real world is nasty. It's like, I mean, when I was in New York, I started making friends with pastors in other denominations because I was like, this may get too real for some of these Southern Baptist folk. They're not ready. I need some Lutherans over here. They're ready for anything. Yeah. Let's talk to that guy. But it's like, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, this is a good segue because we as Christians acknowledge by the very virtue of being Christian that we do not have it together. You can't have it together to be a Christian. You got to be vulnerable. Like, the prerequisite is weakness and sin. We don't want to project that. That's scary. But at the end of the day, God's calling broken people, and He became broken for us to save us.
We need to remember that the step in Rome acknowledging our humanity, Jesus became one of us so He could experience.
That's right. 100%. Yeah. And He had to. And it's like the whole point of my book, the major thesis is God motivates vulnerable people like you and me to love other vulnerable people by becoming vulnerable for us. And when we realize that our mission is in our mess, that ultimately it's our weakness that qualifies us. Yes, the thing that we think disqualifies us actually qualifies us to serve other weak people. Have you ever had, almost every time I speak, seriously, almost every time I speak, I talk about vulnerable people, loving other vulnerable people. There's always someone who's working the steps who comes up and talks to me. They'd be like, hey, excuse me, man. Excuse me. You a friend of Bill W? I'm like, nah, but I respect him. I launched my nonprofit and my book in the church that launched AA. So yes, big fan of AA. Like, I'm a big fan of I really loved how it was founded because it was very Christian. There's a book called Grace and Addiction that goes back to those original days. And it's amazing. But just that anonymity let people be open and honest. And so I love it. But what's cool is it's those people who are working the steps oftentimes that are like, how can I help? Because they've been to the bottom. They know what it feels like. And when they care for somebody else, that person's like, oh, you're my people. So, yeah.
Is there any statistics about those who are trafficked that have come from a faith-based, like church people, or have you seen that at all? Is there any coalition, and should there not be a consideration because anyone can be who's going through something?
Yeah, I don't think there, as far as I know, there might be, but if there is, it's new. I haven't seen any statistics that break it down by religion, but
we should be aware, even in our own congregation, churches, someone that some of the earmarks you're talking about should heighten our awareness.
This will turn your hair white. Like, it might already be white, so I apologize. I'm getting it here. But this will turn your hair white. It's like this. Oh. No one prepared me for this. No one prepared me that my 40s were going to do this. But I like it. I won't get rid of it. No, just for men. But the point I want to make is you get these people that we just assume, we bring in these people to work with our churches, and every now and then I'll have a pastor who calls me and they're like, something's weird with this basketball program that's in our community, and they use our church gym, and I've noticed that the kids are staying in this house, and it's basically a flop house. It's not healthy. They're not being paid. They're brought from other countries to play here, and they're not financially compensated. They don't have money for food. They're dressed poorly. And so we I called one of my friends in Homeland Security, and we got them on that real fast. It looked like it had the earmarks of trafficking. Sometimes there was this group, I can't remember, I couldn't out them to save my life because I don't remember their name, but they basically brought children from Africa to churches to sing. And I don't know which one. I know that there's several that do that, but there was trafficking involved. And they were going from church to church to church. In your church, you have vulnerable people. Traffickers know that. They will come to your church. They will look just like you. They love the grace thing because now, oftentimes, when we say we want to show grace to the victim and the victimizer, oftentimes we show a lot of grace to the victimizer. Sometimes not as much grace to the victim. And so it's always something to keep our eyes on. But yeah, if you have a divorce care in your ministry, if you have a youth group, if you have children's church, if you have people at all, you have vulnerable people that could be exploited. And I don't mean to be all big brother, but if you know someone, like if you knew me like really well and you saw me, like I have some tells, like when if I get sad or I'm going through a funk, there are things that I do. And if you're like, man, you've eaten a lot of Oreos and cookies and cream, ice cream recently, Raleigh. You okay? That's my go-to. I tear it up. But then you would know me well enough to be like, you all right? You need to talk? We got to know our people. And it's not just your job. It's our job to prepare our people to be able to have those conversations and have that messy community.
Sometimes I don't think there's at large anywhere in the system in place to help these people because the burden is too large and the pain is too deep and wounds are too deep and healing is getting like people say it's too dirty, it's too much for me, I can't handle divorce, and your 12-step program from addiction to regen and all the ministry. But to come across face-to-face somebody who's been, as a child or anything like that, sexually exploited or a lot of abuse like that, that's a lot of mental, emotional trauma that I don't think at large in general, there's any system in place to people who are prepared and equipped to handle that kind of, it's a lot of baggage that comes with it and it transfers over to people who are not ready for that.
And that's why we started. That's why I started to let my people go, because I realized that oftentimes most churches, most church leadership teams, we're all well-meaning. Everyone's well-meaning. I say oftentimes because I've met some people who I'm like, is that person well-meaning? I mean, yeah, I had one person, I was speaking in Queens while I was writing my book, and I shouldn't have spoken at this event. Because I had nothing to give. But in the middle of my talk, he goes, "You are wrong. Churches should not fight human trafficking, da-da-da-da." And he's like yelling at me. And so I was like, okay. I was like, and we had a lively debate. But it was, I think, even him, he was probably well-meaning. But I do think he was scared, and I think it was easier to outsource it. But you don't have to outsource Jesus' love. Like, he became like us to free us to love others and to understand his love for us. So as we're loving him, we're loving others. It's this beautiful thing. But
I noticed most of your stories, your illustrations, your examples, people maybe of other cultures. Is ethnicity a major factor in this? Does it seem to be?
well, in the United States, sorry.
Other cultures, are they more vulnerable, seemingly?
Well, it's interesting. No, but yes.
And I ask this for a personal reason. We share our church with a South Korean church. So we have a lot of people coming straight from South Korea into the United States, and they're dealing with the cultural shock of that transition too. And so I'm wondering, are these people maybe more susceptible, more vulnerable?
Well, for sake of time, I'm gonna kind of dive into that and kind of abandon my notes here. But no, you're good, because this is a worthwhile question. If you Google human trafficking, and we're gonna get real here for a minute because I think we can. If you Google human trafficking, what you're going to see, an image search, you're going to see predominantly, it's so frustrating, you're going to see white hands of a young, middle-class white girl chained or tied together. Oftentimes the chains are psychological. We talked about grooming. White and majority population people are trafficked, 100%, and many of them are trafficked. Like you can see on like things like OnlyFans or Pornhub, you can see their exploitation live, because not everyone who's smiling on the other side of the screen chooses to be there. And so, yes, you also see a lot of white women being trafficked in street prostitution. But disproportionately, the community of color is targeted and exploited more. The buyers are often, especially here, more Caucasian. But yeah, the community of color, the LGBT community, and other marginalized communities are disproportionately impacted. I try to be careful, but because I'll talk sometimes and people will be like, okay, so let's just focus on the massage parlors. I'm like, well, that's just the Asian community's type of exploitation. And there are other massage parlors that have people of other ethnicities, but you have street prostitution, and street prostitution in every community looks different. You have people who are trafficked for I mentioned OnlyFans, webcams, stuff like that. And then you have the movement where people are saying, no, we need to legalize or regulate prostitution. Man, okay, so my book had just come out. I get a call from a rabbi. He was like New York's rabbi, Joe Potasnik, and he used to say, when Cardinal Dolan needs to confess his sins, he comes to me. Like that was just his personality. He calls me. He's like, Raleigh, bring your book. We got to go meet with the DA of Brooklyn. Now, Brooklyn was teetering on making prostitution legal, and so we sat in his office. We talked to him. I gave him my book, which it'd be cool if he read it, but I don't know. He seemed like a busy guy, and No, well, what happened was it did shift. Like they didn't regulate it there. They went to a different model. Now they're not policing it. But what we found is when the government regulates it, you just have the government brand of it, and then there's still a demand, because that's a big part of human trafficking. There's supply and demand, whether it's for sex, labor, domestic servitude. If there's a demand for it, like based on like what you buy, what you eat, what you watch, you are casting a vote for the world you want to live in. And so if there's a demand, there will always be a supply. And so basically, there are a couple of models of response, but we found when people like totally just regulate, people are going to go for a more intense version. So people are going to be trafficked. And what we found is most communities of color are going to be disproportionately targeted, but others will be targeted as well. Then you have the model and it's not a perfect model, but the model I advocate is the partial decriminalization model, where the people who are in the life are being sold. You basically decriminalize them and you say, hey, here's some services. We want to help you. But you criminalize the buyers and the sellers. And one of the biggest problems with that model is, like in New York, they went for it, but they didn't do any. Like the police just kind of, it was during the pandemic, but they just kind of left it, and so they just didn't do anything for a season. And so, I think if we criminalize the buyers and the sellers, we're going to push back on demand. But as pastors, that's something we should be aware of: is how do we create demand? How does our church create demand? Like when we buy clothing for our youth groups, are we buying the cheapest shirts? Well, who paid the price? Because if we're not paying the full price, someone is. And so sometimes we baptize it in this idea of thriftiness is next to godliness, but what if that wasn't a scriptural idea? And what if paying more, we were able to actually care for our neighbor? Both the neighbor that we see, yes, but the neighbor that we don't see, who creates all our products and all that. And so, yeah.
Can't that be a hiding place too, a little straw man or something that's not, because you can buy something that's cheap, that's been fairly paid for, but you can also buy something that's very expensive that they have in fact still had, human trafficking at some other end in some other country, they're just making more.
Yeah, I think that's something to always look into because supply chains matter, and a lot of supply chains are very murky. I have a friend who works he has like a business where they go into these garment factories in South Asia, and they say, we're going to give you financial incentive to treat your employees well. So give them back their passports, don't lock the doors, let them work, an acceptable amount of hours, give them time off, and if you do that, we'll make sure you get paid this, and we'll bring in buyers and yada, yada, yada. And that seems to work. But yes, like if a company is just throwing a label on and they're not paying attention to the supply chain, it's not okay. But a good website to look at it's called slaveryfootprint.org. And it shows you how, based on our current purchases and what we do, how many people are exploited to give us the life that we crave. But it also goes into, they have a thing where you can send emails to the companies that you like to make sure that they start shoring up their supply chains. I used to like to buy clothes at H&M, and I'll never forget that they were basically called out for using Uzbekistani cotton, and Uzbekistani cotton was at that point it was basically farmed by children who were enslaved. And so they're like, we're not using Uzbek cotton. And they had to put a whole thing on their website because so many people called it out. A lot of the fish that we can get in our grocer's freezer, like the good cheap stuff, it's worth thinking about where could that come from, because a lot of it comes from Thai fishing trawlers. And a lot of these are vulnerable people. They're on the boats, and I've heard reports of like people getting tired or being slow, being shot and thrown overboard. It's slavery in its truest sense. And so,
But if you think about it, when I went to Walmart and Sam's, I talked to the highest managers there, and I said, "Do we not have any fish from America? Why is this?"
yeah.
And trace that thing. That was in that whole phrase, that entire thing, fish section. I'm not gonna buy any of the fish if you stop it. But I mean, that's Christians, and you talk about churches, they can't take a stand on abortion or simple matters. You can get two Baptists to agree on basic fundamental things. This is deep. This is very heavy, emotional, mental, and go to the human trafficking typical sense, because now you're taking human trafficking to a level where there's a forced labor and stuff. We're not even going there. I mean, this is a heavy subject when we can't take a stand on simple things. So there's a lot of courage required, a lot of willingness to sacrifice, pay the price, and they're not very many Paul and Silas are willing to take stripes from their back and spend nights in jail. No, they're not.
Well, and there's one way to ease our churches into this, and it's easy, but it's slowly but surely, because we love to talk about things like how our sins impact our relationship with God vertically. We love to talk about that. We love to talk about sanctification in terms of our relationship with God. But there is that horizontal element too, right? Like, how do our sins impact our neighbors? And repentance is recognizing something is ultimately for me rather than for God and neighbor. It's this disobeying of God. And I think yeah, I think at the end of the day, when we look at even how our unseen neighbor is treated, we can think, okay, so what would it look like how do we do coffee on Sunday mornings? Let's do something that's fair and free, or at least that maybe direct trade. And let's tell our people, when we're speaking about pornography or sex outside of marriage, let's bring up this aspect of it does create demand too. Because a lot of people just don't know. I didn't know when I was called into this ministry that, and I was a pastor, but the pornography that I had seen could have been of people who were exploited. And when I realized that I created demand, that I was part of the problem, I was never a buyer, but I had seen things. And so many of us have. For me, that there was that moment of, God, I'm sorry. And then right when that was it. It wasn't this beautiful prayer. It was like, God, my bad. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I could tell you where I was sitting. And right after that, I sensed it, that bad pizza feeling, that like something's going on here and I don't know what it is. And it was like, you're going to do something. And I'm like, I wear cardigans. I'm not going to kick down the door of a brothel. But I knew in that moment I was supposed to do something. I ran from it until I couldn't run anymore. And God sent me to New York to start letting my people go. And so I would say at the end of the day, it's taking the things that you already talk about, because you already talk about these things, and showing them how there are some added things of how this not only impacts your relationship with God, this impacts your relationship with your neighbor, whether you see that neighbor or that neighbor is unseen. And so we are now ready to go to lunch, and so I want to honor that time. But I really appreciate your questions, because Matt, he steered me wrong on this. He said they're probably not going to ask many questions. And so I'm like looking at my notes and I'm like, we're going to get creative with, I don't have to say everything. I'm at that point in my ministry. I don't have to say everything, but I'm like, this has been good because I feel like this is what has needed to be said. And so when we come back, we're going to do it in a little bit of a different way, and we're going to cover a lot of the rest. But my gosh, gentlemen, thank you for your questions. Thank you for caring. Thank you for caring for your community. Huh? What? Well, you have no idea. Sometimes it's rough. I'm like, is this thing on? It's like.
They didn't warn you about the crazy guy down the street.
No, you all have been asking questions, and I thank you for it, because I don't want to talk and you guys be like, okay, that's good, and you just walk away. I want you to interact with us, and I know it's emotional, I know it's hard, but we're here together. It's a safe place. We're going to do it together. But what we're going to do together now is we're going to go eat. And so can I pray for us? Yes. So, Lord, I'm moved by this. I'm moved by these men who have been called by you to care for vulnerable people, not only in their congregation, but in their community. I'm moved and challenged by the fact that they want to care for the whole person. And so I pray that for the rest of the afternoon, as we talk about this, that, Lord, you do something amazing. You begin to give direction. You begin to bring conviction. You begin to challenge. And may whatever happens here not stop here. We got enough of it here. But may they take it to their congregations. May they not get over it. And may their communities change, because there is a pastor in a community that cares so much that the people in the community realize that church is not a mausoleum, but it's a mission center. It's in your name we pray. Amen.